with all our policy tools and prudential measures, India remains connected to the global economy, which means global shocks will somehow find their way to us. How exactly does that happen? Global shocks reach India through four main channels. Number one is the trade channel, the import and export. Number two is the capital flows channel, the FPI and FDI that we saw. The third is the commodity price channel, which we will see shortly, and the financial contagion channel, which we will also see shortly. Just to recap, the trade channel is straightforward. Whenever there is a recession in the outside world like US or Europe, then their demand for Indian exports will go down, and that reduces our exports and that impacts our GDP, very simply. And it happened in 2008 when the world went through global financial crisis. Global trade volumes also fell sharply, even though our banking system had largely insulated everybody. The capital flow channels also work similarly through FPI flows largely. When global investors become risk averse, say there is some tightening by the Federal Reserve or geopolitical tensions, they will pull money out of India, and this causes rupee depreciation and the stock market may fall. The 2013 taper tantrum episode is a classic example of this. Fed just announced that it would slow down on its bonds purchases, and that triggered a massive outflow from India, causing the rupee to depreciate sharply. The commodity price channel is basically the channel that affects us because India imports most of its oil. So when global prices of oil spike up, it could be due to Middle East tensions or supply disruptions or Russia-Ukraine war, then our import prices shoot up because oil is a major raw material in the production of any commodity. So that is the commodity price channel. When our import bill of oil shoots up, the current account deficit widens, and as a result, because the import bill has gone up, they are going to pass over the increased cost of oil to the ultimate customer. The inflation also goes up. The 2022 Russia-Ukraine war has essentially played on this channel. Oil prices jumped from $70 a barrel to about $120 per barrel, immediately impacting India's trade balances and the domestic inflation. The last channel is the financial contagion channel. This is slightly more subtle. Whenever a crisis hits the emerging market, investors often withdraw from all the emerging market. Okay? It is almost like when one sneezes, everybody gets cold. During the 1997 Asian crisis, for example, even though India had nothing to do with Thailand's problems, we experienced capital outflows and currency pressure simply because we were classified as an emerging market. So that goes on to say that even though we might be managing our systems quite well, just because we are put in the same bucket as every other emerging economy, there is an impact that we will have to endure. Understanding these channels helps policymakers prepare the forex reserves as a cushion against capital flow shocks, or they might want to diversify their export destination. That reduces the trade channel vulnerability because you are not dependent on any one particular country. And you also start investing in other sources of power beyond oil. So you reduce your oil dependence. Now that we have covered these transmission channels, what about the policy tools that directly shape our integration with the world, like trade policy? This brings us to this very interesting segment on the trade policy. Trade policy is something that you would often read in the newspapers. For example, in this newspaper of today, there is a headline article about Modi and Trump calling some trade deal. Trade policies are an important arsenal in the government's ammunition stack in terms of regulating exchange rate and our integration with the world. Trade policy instruments are really these measures that the government can take to influence the quantity and composition of exports and imports, and it goes beyond the usual monetary policy. The most common instrument in trade policy is the tariff. Tariff is simply a tax that we can impose on the imported goods, or somebody might impose tariff on our exports. What it really does is that any tax makes a thing expensive. So, if we impose tariff on other people's products, then we are making our exports expensive. If other people impose tariff on us, they are making our products expensive. So, you are basically playing with the relative prices of goods by just using policy of tariff. Tariffs also serve a useful purpose. If you are imposing tariff on the foreign goods, then in a way you are protecting your domestic producers of the same good. So, you are protecting your domestic industries from foreign competition. Sometimes whenever an industry is in its initial stages, then the government wants to protect that industry, and it might impose tariffs on the products that are being imported from what the industry produces. These are called as import tariffs. Similar to import tariffs, there is a policy on quantity called as import quotas. For example, you can only import X amount of quantity of a certain thing. So, India might only allow, for example, 100,000 tons of wheat imports per year, regardless of price or demand. So, it works to ration the quantity, the other thing works to ration the price. Subsidies work entirely in reverse. The government might actually subsidize our exporters so that they are able to make things cheaply and are able to price their products competitively in the foreign markets. Export subsidies have been very common in the past, but now sometimes they are also restricted. Then there could be non-tariff barriers, that are regulations that could restrict trade without explicit taxes or quotas. So, for example, you could probably put a stringent quality standard. You could say that I can only deal or import if a certain thing meets a certain quality standard. That is not a quantity restriction, that is neither a tax restriction or a tariff thing, it is just simply the quality of a particular thing, a quality standard. You could also have complex licensing requirements, okay, increase the paperwork, etc. That may just create a lot of barriers. Then there are obviously these trade agreements that you can get into with certain countries. These are largely treaties where countries mutually decide to reduce tariffs or incentivize trade with each other. India has many free trade agreements with countries from the ASEAN group, the Korea, Japan and the UAE amongst others. Then of course, there is this anti-dumping duties, which are essentially special tariffs that are imposed when foreign companies are selling goods below their cost price to drive out domestic competition. That is also something that has happened with India in the past. India has imposed anti-dumping duties on Chinese steel and other products. So, India's approach to these larger instruments of trade policy has only evolved over time. It was never the same across the last few decades. Our economy has changed, our economic philosophy has changed. Let us trace that evolution. In this segment, we are going to understand the evolution of India's trade policy. India's trade policy has gone through distinct phases which reflect the economic thinking and the political priorities of its time. Now, let's roll back a couple of decades. Let's go back to independence. In the first few decades after independence, India was a poor country. We followed what is called as an import substitution industrialization. The idea was that we would produce everything domestically and minimize imports because we wanted to save on foreign exchange reserves, and that would also help us build self-reliance. That was the prevailing economic thought. So, from 1950s to 1980s, that is precisely what we did. But what it meant was high tariffs, sometimes even exceeding 100%. A strict import licensing. So, you needed government permission to import. And export pessimism. We never really had the belief that we could compete globally, so why even try? As a result of these 3 decades of high protectionism, the industries that were protected became inefficient and uncompetitive, because that is usually what happens when you provide something in a sheltered environment to somebody, that person becomes lazy and becomes uncompetitive. That is what the state of our domestic sector was. We did save on some foreign exchange, but we grew very slowly, often at the rate of 3 to 4%, while everybody else in East Asia was almost growing at around 8 to 10%. Then the 1991 crisis happened. The 1991 balance of payment crisis forced a dramatic shift. We slashed tariffs, we eliminated import licensing, we devalued the rupee to make exports competitive, and we opened up to foreign trade and investment. That is dubbed as the liberalization reforms of the 1990s. So through the 1990s and the 2000s, early 2000s, India started to progressively liberalize. Now you have to also remember the backdrop. 1991 is when the reforms get initiated. The IT sector starts to only happen. 1995, 1997 is when the Googles and the Yahoos of the world are developing. The Infosys, the Wipros and the TCS, they are starting to find some footing. It's only in the early 2000s that our services sector became progressively linked to the world. The average tariff rates also fell from around 80% to around 15%. Globalization has started to happen across the world. So India also signed many free trade agreements. Our exports grew rapidly, particularly the service exports in IT business processes. Outsourcing, the rise of the BPOs happened around that time. So this was a period that was characterized by optimism about globalization. The belief that when you integrate with the global economy through trade, it would bring growth, jobs and prosperity. That remained the prevailing belief across the world, that more global integration, better trade across countries will mean more growth and jobs. But since the mid 2010s, there have been a subtle shift towards strategic autonomy. India has started to become a little bit more cautious about free trade agreements. It has started to raise tariffs, especially on things like electronics and solar panels, and has started to emphasize self-reliance through the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat. And this isn't a return to the old style protectionism. It is not a return to the old style licensing Raj, but it is a more nuanced approach. What this approach is about is that it is telling you to remain open wherever we are competitive, such as services sector, pharmaceuticals, auto components. So we are globally competitive in these sectors. So we welcome trade, we are open. But we are going to protect strategically the important sectors like defense. And we are also going to use trade policy as a tool for industrial development. This policy stance reflects the lessons that we have learned over the last 30-40 years. Globalization does bring benefits, but it also brings vulnerabilities. For example, in COVID, there were global supply chain disruptions. Now, if you were highly dependent upon these global supply chains, if you were importing some stuff from elsewhere and you had no domestic way to produce it, then it would have taken you for a ride. And we also realized that some degree of self-sufficiency is critical in certain sectors that are important for national security and economic resilience. And that is the change that we are increasingly seeing through this Atmanirbhar Bharat policy. Today's policy is not about blanket full integration, it's about managed integration. You participate in global trade where it benefits you, where you have the competitive advantage, but you also build domestic capabilities in strategic areas. And you negotiate the terms of FTAs carefully to ensure that there are reciprocal benefits that get accrued to you, rather than accepting just any deal for the sake of openness. And that brings us full circle. From fixed exchange rates to flexible ones, from closed capital accounts to managed openness, from autarky to strategic integration, open economy macroeconomics is a fascinating piece. It isn't just theory, it is actually the lived experience of the journey of several countries, including India. And in the next segment, we are going to look at some of these journeys of these countries over the last few decades.